Let's now discuss what's going to happen to the low mass stars in terms of their stellar structure. What happens as they start to run out of hydrogen to burn. So, let's try another quick question, right? Let's say we have a main sequence star and the temperature in the core suddenly increases. What happens, right? Well, if the temperature goes up, fusion reaction should, we can eliminate, decrease, or remain unchanged. If temperature is going up, the number of collisions is going up, so the fusion rate is definitely going to increase. And pretty straightforward, I hope, is that, hey, if the temperature's up, the fusion's gone up, the protons, they got to be moving around faster and faster. So we're burning more and more hydrogen. We're going through it quicker and quicker. That's the theme here. Let's now actually look at this internal structure. A couple of things in these plots here, so let's walk through this together. Each one of these curves here is a representation of the sun as a fraction of its radius. Where we have here, we're inside the deep core of the sun, and we go out to the outer layers of the sun, right? One is one solar radius. And the y-axis, we're looking at the percent of mass there. And we're going to look at just the two main elements that are present, hydrogen and helium. Here's the emphasis now. Look at the core. When the sun was birthed, when it turned from a protostar to a fusing star, it was predominantly hydrogen. Think about the blue. Mostly hydrogen. There is helium present, and that's throughout the entirety of the star. Now, hydrogen is at a fairly consistent rate being burned into helium through that proton-proton chain. So now we go about 5 billion years from the sun's birth to where the sun is now, rounding of course. And like I said, the amount of hydrogen in the sun has been consumed. It has been burned into helium. So when you look at the core, the amount of helium is steadily increasing, whereas the amount of hydrogen is decreasing in the core. Now let's go into the far lifespan. We said the sun's going to live for about 10 billion years, and the sun is about a little bit closer to 5 billion years old. So let's go to near the end of the sun's life as a main sequence star. And at that point, the helium's almost completely filled the core. There's almost no hydrogen left in the core of the sun. Helium's completely filling this up now. We can look at the stellar pictures, where A is star at birth. You've got a hydrogen burning core in the center, and then around that, what you could call the stellar envelope. Just all of this hot plasma that surrounds the core, energized by the energy released by the core, but no fusions happening here. Only fusions in the core. Then we go to the end of the star's life. And what do we find? What we're going to find is still the stellar envelope on the outermost layers. We're now going to have what's called the hydrogen burning shell. It's going to be a little shell around the core where hydrogen's still hot enough to be burning, or fusing to be correct. And then in the core itself, a helium core. There's just a whole lot of helium present there. And then you have to say, well, when does that helium fuse? Can it fuse? And what does it fuse into? So, here is an example of our main sequence star, and it's eventually going to turn into what we call a red giant. Here's the sequence of events. When that core runs out of hydrogen fuel, you're left with this inert helium core. Helium that's just trapped in there, and no fusion's happening. The temperature, the pressure is not high enough. The core will then shrink. Be careful with me. The core shrinks down. No more energy to resist that inward crushing pull of gravity. The core itself is going to be filled with a bunch of ionized materials, a bunch of ionized atoms, because the electrons are just stripped off of material. And gravity keeps trying to crush and crush. Eventually, in the sea here, in the bottom here, we're going to have just a bunch of helium atoms and electrons that are being squeezed more and more together. So now we have to start talking about the quantum nature of these things. I can't say an electron is just this free-flying particle bouncing around. It's technically what we call a fermion. What this means is basically what kind of probabilities apply to electrons interacting. Simplest way to sum this up is that electrons obey what we call this Pauli exclusion principle. What does that mean? No two fermions can occupy the same quantum state. What is that? Okay, think back to our energy levels. When we said, hey, here's a hydrogen atom and it's got an electron orbiting it and another, you could have the electron in different energy shells. And it changes shells by either emitting a photon or absorbing a photon. We're talking about those energy states. The electron can have its own energy states by itself, independent of being being attached to an atom. And those electrons, by definition of the universe, properties of the physical universe, those electrons can't live on the same shelf. So here's the picture. Right? Here's our helium core, bunch of helium atoms flying around, and the electrons are feeling like this purple cloud. They're just what we call this degenerate electron sea. We call it a sea because we like to think of electrons filling all of this space like a fluid to float in. And as we keep packing in the pressure, the electrons cannot go into the same energy state. And so we start to generate what's called a degeneracy pressure. The pressure in the electrons starts to go up. There's not more electrons there. Gravity can't keep squeezing it further and further. So this electron degeneracy pressure starts to grow and grow. All right. So that degeneracy pressure is pushing outwards now. The electrons don't want to be squeezed, pushed together anymore. And that means that the temperature is going to start increasing. The pressure is going to go up in the core. All right. Now look at what happens to the bulk of the star. That inert core, remember that shrunk down and you have that hydrogen burning shell? We're now starting to increase the pressure in the core. As the pressures are changing in the core, the star, well, it balloons in size, right? The star will basically rebalance. It grows in size. As it grows, it's going to cool off. Let me repeat this. The star grows in size and it cools off. However, just because it's a cooler star, it actually becomes more luminous. The star is starting off as tiny. Because of the changes in the core, the pressure changes in the core, the rest of the star, it will balloon outwards. As the rest, right, not the core, we're talking about just the bigger outer layer star. As the rest of that balloons up in size, it will cool off. So the temperature is going down. But the luminosity has gone up because the volume has increased. There is now more surface area for photons to leave this thing. Right? If you want to help remember this, think about that Stefan-Boltzmann law, where you have the luminosities related to the size of the star and the temperature. And because that size is increasing, the luminosity keeps growing. So, the star that was once on the main sequence ran out of hydrogen and it leaves that main sequence. The main sequence stars turns into a red giant star. And I'm going to repeat this over and over again. Main sequence star, core of hydrogen, runs out of hydrogen, you now have a core of helium. At this stage in this star's life, that helium's inert. It's just inert helium surrounded by a bunch of free electrons, creating that degeneracy pressure. Now around this inert core is going to be what's called the hydrogen burning shell. This is a region around the star where hydrogen is still fusing. And we see the temperature goes down a little bit The star goes down on the HR diagram temperature, but that luminosity increase because of the swelling in size. And now this starts to create what we like to use an analogy as a snowball effect. Right? There's a smaller, more massive degenerate helium core. Right? This leads to stronger gravitational forces. As the pressures are going up, the gravitational force is mass increasing. Boom, there's more gravity. More gravity in the core means higher pressure, and hydrogen burning shell leads to the faster the nucleus is burning, which leads to a greater conversion rate of hydrogen around the core, which means more helium is being produced around the inert core. Because remember, there's that hydrogen burning shell. So that hydrogen burning shell is converting into helium, and that helium is being dumped into the inner core. And so the dumping of that inner core now starts to fuel this. The star continues to swell in size, turn into this bigger and bigger red giant. Eventually, the pressures and temperatures are going to reach a critical level. And that freely moving helium will eventually start to fuse when the temperature of that inert core reaches about 100,000 Kelvin. When you get to about 100,000 Kelvin, those helium start to collide and fuse together. And now we've gone from an inert core to a new type of fusing core. The predominant process is what we call the triple alpha process. And the triple alpha process is how we go from heliums to carbon and energy out. Now, before I go through this in a bit more detail, why do we call it the triple alpha process? Bit of history for you. We're going to talk about radiation and our human understanding of it. So you might have heard of things about alpha particles, beta particles, gamma particles, or just this catch-all alpha, beta, gamma radiation. What the heck are those? Well, the naming scheme just came from how we learned about these. We're humans, we conduct experiments. You might have this perspective that some genius just intuited how the universe works, and it's now facts for me to lecture to you. But we did experiments, and here's a schematic representation of our experiments on radiation, hence, and why we call things these alpha particles. So here's the thing. We had radioactive sources, and what we called alpha particles was just the radiation that got blocked by a simple piece of paper. That's all you needed. All you needed to defend yourself from alpha radiation was a nice little piece of paper. And you could block all of that harmful alpha rays. Alpha rays aren't that dangerous. But our experiments with radiation continue, and we found what we eventually dubbed beta particles. The paper wasn't enough. The beta particles could just plow right through the paper. So you needed an aluminum shield. If I held up an aluminum plate, I could now stop the beta particles from hitting me. And we continue. Even the aluminum wasn't sufficient to stop this gamma particles. The gamma plows right through the paper. It penetrates straight through the aluminum. It takes a block of lead for me to stop gamma rays. And in fact, that's not necessarily sufficient. You can talk about concepts called the penetration depth of how far that photon or that gamma particle will penetrate into the lead. And so the origin of these names, alpha, beta, gamma, was just how deep these different types of radiations could penetrate and puncture through something. Now, as our growing of scientific body of knowledge grew, we eventually realized that what we called alpha particles were actually helium atoms. Remember what we said on the last slide, that triple alpha process? We call it alpha because it's a bunch of helium particles. Alpha particles are helium atoms flying around. Beta particles, they're electrons. They're high energy electrons moving at great speeds. Whereas the gamma particles, they're high energy photons. Very dangerous. Very dangerous. These things will penetrate through tons of things. This type of gamma ray radiation, it actually could potentially get through a block of lead. It is that energetic. So, with this tangent away, let's remember that the triple alpha process is named so because it involves helium nuclei flying around. The alpha means helium. So, let's wrap this part up by actually discussing the triple alpha process. All right, what we're going to have is helium-4 atoms, 2 helium-4s. Remember, we've got a core that's now just flooded with just helium atoms flying around. And the temperature is high enough, the speeds of these particles are high enough, they'll eventually smack together. And when that happens, these 2 helium atoms will fuse. They'll give off a little bit of energy as a gamma ray. All right, that's more energy to radiate away from the star. And they'll form into beryllium. This beryllium left to itself, it will not be very stable. But in the short lifespan of this beryllium atom, if it collides with another helium atom, hey, wouldn't you know it, there are a ton of helium atoms just floating around in that core. So this beryllium hits with helium, boom, another photon comes up, that's energy to fuel the star, keep its life going, and output a carbon atom. So the core started off at the beginning of the star's life as a bunch of hydrogen. It fused into a bunch of helium. And then eventually, the life changed a little bit, but eventually the pressure went up enough that the helium started fusing together in what's called this triple alpha process. And the end result of that is going to be carbon in the core.